LeFrak City, a dense stretch of high-rise apartments where money was tight and the sidewalks stayed loud. His mother, Joan, held the family together in poverty, doing the heavy work of raising a gifted child with far more attention than resources. His father wasn't in the picture. In fact, Kenny would not meet the man until he was well into his 30s. So here was the setup that would shape everything that followed. A boy raised in hard circumstances, carrying a talent so rare that adults treated him like a finished superstar before he'd learned a single thing about building a life. Basketball was a gift, but it was also a weight, placed early and heavy on shoulders that were still a child's. And long before he could legally drive, one high school in Queens would turn him into a name spoken in the same breath as Lou Alcindor, and the records he set there would stand for more than a decade. At Archbishop Molloy High School, Kenny Anderson stopped being a promising kid and became a New York playground legend, ranked as the #1 high school player in the country. Scouts placed him ahead of Jimmy Jackson and Shaquille O'Neal. It was a loaded generation, and Kenny sat at the top before any of them had played a college game. The honors piled up fast. Gatorade, Parade, Naismith, USA Today, and the New York State Sports Writers Association all named him National High School Player of the Year. He became New York State Mr. Basketball and a 4-time Parade All-American, a feat not accomplished since Lou Alcindor. That comparison did more than praise a teenager. It placed an adult-sized expectation on every game that followed. And that was the first great danger in Kenny Anderson's story. The mistake was not his. It was the way adults began treating a child as a future professional asset before he had learned how to be anything except an extraordinary basketball player. Then there's the number that mattered most: 2,621 points. That was his all-time New York State high school scoring record, a mark that stood until Sebastian Telfair broke it in 2004, more than a decade at the top. But here's the human detail that keeps the hype honest. His coach, the legendary Jack Curran, reportedly benched him for the first quarter of every single game during his freshman year. 2,600 points, and he was still being sat down to start ball games. It was a quiet lesson in humility for a boy the whole city was already crowning. Every major program in the country wanted him, but in November of 1988, he made a choice that surprised people who assumed he'd stay close to the powers of the Northeast. He didn't pick North Carolina. He didn't pick Duke. He didn't pick Syracuse. In November of 1988, Kenny Anderson signed his letter of intent to play for Georgia Tech, walking past the blue blood powers of the East to head down south. It raised eyebrows, and then it paid off almost immediately. At Georgia Tech, Anderson lined up beside Dennis Scott and Brian Oliver, and the three formed one of college basketball's most feared trios, known nationwide as Lethal Weapon 3. In 1990, the #4 seed tore through the bracket, eliminated a young Shaquille O'Neal and LSU, and reached the Final Four. Eventual champion UNLV ended the run, but Anderson had already proved that the celebrated New York schoolboy could direct a team on college basketball's largest stage. Then Scott and Oliver moved on, and the weight shifted fully onto Kenny's shoulders. His sophomore season, he responded by averaging nearly 26 points a game, a scorer and a floor general in one. But that Georgia Tech team, a #8 seed in the 1991 tournament, bowed out in the second round to Ohio State. Soon after, Anderson made his decision. 2 years of college, and he was gone. At barely 20 years old, he put his name in the 1991 NBA draft and became the youngest player in the entire league before he'd learned what that league could take from a young man. On draft night in 1991, the New Jersey Nets called Kenny Anderson's name with the second overall pick, second in the whole country. And because he'd left college after just 2 years, he arrived as the youngest player in the entire NBA that season, a kid stepping into a grown man's league, still learning the pro game on the fly. The start was humble. Rookies rarely take over, and Kenny's first year was a period of adjustment more than domination. But the leap came fast. By his second season, he nearly doubled his numbers across the board. More points, more rebounds, more assists, and helped push the Nets into the 1993 playoffs. This was the version of Kenny Anderson the scouts had promised all those years ago. The numbers only describe part of what made him special. Anderson was a left-handed point guard with a playground handle, sudden changes of direction, and the balance to finish after slipping past a defender. He was not an oversized guard overpowering people. He created advantages with rhythm, angles, and imagination. The New York showmanship was there, but so was the discipline Jack Curran had demanded at Molloy. Run the team, know where every teammate wanted the ball, and still recognize the moment to take the opening yourself. At his best, Kenny did not simply bring the ball up the floor. He made 5 players move to his timing. The improving Nets were not built around Anderson alone. Derek Coleman supplied power inside, and Dražen Petrović stretched defenses with fearless shooting. Chuck Daly saw enough talent to imagine an Eastern Conference contender growing around the three of them. Anderson's speed and passing connected the pieces, giving New Jersey a young core whose best basketball appeared to be waiting just ahead. For a moment, everything looked exactly as it had been written years earlier. A young, brilliant point guard in New Jersey, an all-star, a rising core. But the future the Nets were building toward was about to be shattered by a tragedy no one saw coming. Chuck Daly had coached Michael Jordan and the Dream Team. He'd built champions in Detroit. So when Daly took over the Nets and looked at his roster, he saw the makings of something special. A young core that could grow into a power in the Eastern Conference. At the center of that vision were 3 names. Kenny Anderson at the point, Derek Coleman up front, and a shooting guard from Croatia with a scorer's heart and a killer's confidence, Dražen Petrović. That was supposed to be New Jersey's big 3. A quick, creative point guard feeding a dominant power forward and one of the purest shooters the league had imported. No roster is guaranteed to own an era, but this one was young enough to make the possibility feel reasonable. New Jersey believed the foundation had been built. Then came the summer of 1993. Petrović lost his life in a car accident at 28. The human loss stood beyond basketball, and the competitive consequences could not be repaired with a transaction. New Jersey entered the next season without a teammate, friend, and essential part of the future it had imagined. In the season that followed, Kenny Anderson played the best basketball of his career. He averaged 18.8 points and 9.6 assists, both personal highs. On April 15, 1994, he scored 45 points with 14 assists against Detroit. He also earned his only All-Star selection, sharing the Eastern Conference roster with Derek Coleman. The numbers showed what the remaining core could still become, even as Petrovic's absence made the original vision impossible. Before his 24th birthday, Anderson was an all-star, producing nearly 19 points and 10 assists a night. Within 2 years, the team that had drafted him second overall would move on, and a career once defined by one city's expectations would begin scattering across the league. The all-star point guard and New York prodigy gradually became a traveler. His name appeared more often in transaction columns, and each new uniform made the brief New Jersey peak look less like the beginning of a reign and more like a moment that had already passed. He was not merely being traded, he was becoming the former wonder child the league no longer expected to grow into anything greater. It started in 1996. Anderson was traded to the Charlotte Hornets, arriving mid-season, where he played just 38 games and averaged a little over 15 points. Later that same year, he signed with the Portland Trail Blazers. New uniform, new coast, same restless pattern beginning to form. The most remembered transaction came in 1998 when Portland sent Anderson to Toronto in the Damon Stoudemire deal. Anderson refused to report because he did not want to play in Canada. It was a striking assertion of control by a player under contract, and it left Toronto with little reason to build around an unwilling arrival. 5 days later, the Raptors redirected him to Boston. The decision protected his preference, but it also became part of how fans judged the increasingly restless middle of his career. From there, the map only got busier. He was moved to the Seattle Supersonics in a package built around Vin Baker. At the 2003 trade deadline, he was sent back to the Hornets, now relocated to New Orleans, in a swap for Eldon Campbell. Each stop asked for a little less of him. First, he was expected to control a team, then to stabilize one. Eventually, he was asked only to provide a few reliable minutes. That shrinking job description told the story better than the transaction list. The scorer who once averaged nearly 26 a game in college was becoming a role player, then a backup, then a name on the waiver wire. There is a particular kind of quiet at the back end of a celebrated career. The player can still see the floor, but the openings close faster and the younger guards recover sooner. In September of 2003, Anderson signed with the Indiana Pacers, where he played 44 games and averaged just 6 points a night. The old imagination remained, but the burst that once made defenders lean the wrong way could no longer rescue every possession. His job was now to steady the second unit and hand off knowledge to players who had replaced him in the league's future. A year later, on September 16th of 2004, he signed with the Atlanta Hawks. It didn't last. The Hawks waived him on February 24th of 2005. And then came the stretch that no former All-Star ever wants on his record. Just 4 days later, on February 28th, the Los Angeles Clippers claimed him off waivers. Less than a month after that, on March 25th, they waived him too. Picked up and let go inside a single season. That's how the NBA chapter closed for a man who had once been the second pick in the entire draft. But Kenny wasn't quite ready to stop lacing them up. He took his game overseas, joining Žalgiris Kaunas in Lithuania, one of Europe's proud old basketball clubs. It was a long way from LeFrak City and the front page of the New York sports section. After the 2005 and 2006 season, he was released, and just like that, the professional basketball life was over. 9 NBA franchises, a season in Europe. 15 years of chasing the game that had defined him since 6th grade. On the court, the story was finished. But the hardest chapters of Kenny Anderson's life weren't on any stat sheet, and they were waiting for him the moment the cheering stopped. Over the course of his NBA career, Kenny Anderson earned around $63 million. In 2005, as his playing days wound down, he filed for bankruptcy. The money that was supposed to transform life for a boy raised in poverty had not produced lasting security. How does that happen? The honest answer is that it happens more often than fans realize, and rarely for one simple reason. But for a man who had spent his whole life being told he'd made it, the collapse had to feel like the ground giving way. The pre-written future, the one the city of New York had promised him at 14, had never included the words, "filed for bankruptcy." And then came a loss that no dollar figure could touch. In October of 2005, his mother, Joan, passed away after a heart attack. Remember, this was the woman who raised him alone in those LeFrak City high-rises. The person he'd always said was his reason for chasing the game in the first place. He wanted to provide for her. That was the engine behind everything. Losing her in the same stretch of his life that the money and the career both fell apart left a hole that basketball had never prepared him to fill. Kenny Anderson now stood without the structures that had organized his identity. The playing career was over. The fortune was gone, and his mother was no longer there. His father had remained a stranger until Anderson was in his 30s. The accolades survived, but they could not tell him what the next morning was supposed to look like. But there was something underneath all of it, something Kenny had been carrying since he was a small child, long before the front pages and the records. A deeply painful experience from his early years that he had never spoken about publicly. And soon, in front of a live audience, he would finally decide to say it out loud. In 2013, Kenny Anderson stood in front of a live audience and said something he had never said in public before. On that stage, and later in an interview with SB Nation, he revealed that he had endured a deeply painful experience in his early childhood. Harm, he said, came from two separate people, one from his neighborhood and one from the basketball coaching world. According to those media accounts, he was just 8 and 9 years old when it happened. A small boy, years before the scouts and the front pages, carrying something no child should ever have to carry. Anderson later explained in his own words how basketball had helped him bury the experience for decades. "I became a successful basketball player," he told the New York Post. That's what covered it. The records, rankings, and all-star selection had given him achievement and identity. But in his telling, they also helped conceal pain he had never resolved. The game the city celebrated had become both a career and a hiding place. So why speak now, after all those years of silence? Anderson said his motivation was simple. He wanted to help other people find the courage to come forward. He believed that if folks saw a man like him, a name they knew, a player they'd admired, talking openly about what he'd survived, then maybe they could tell their own stories too. He also announced plans to detail it all in an autobiography he was working on. By turning a private experience into an attempt to help strangers, Anderson changed the purpose of disclosing it. Yet the same period also included 2 Florida arrests, and those incidents require their own careful account, rather than being folded into a simple redemption narrative. The details of the first incident are often blurred. In December of 2011, public records show that Anderson was arrested after his vehicle struck 2 trees and he left the scene. No one was hurt, and he was not charged with impaired driving in that case. The charge concerned leaving the scene, an important distinction from what happened later. Then, in April of 2013, came a separate and different matter. Anderson was arrested in Florida on a drunk driving charge. 2 incidents, roughly a year and a half apart, and only the second one involved that particular allegation. It's easy for people to lump them together, but the record draws a clear line between the two. The consequences of that second arrest reached beyond the courtroom. At the time, Anderson had found something meaningful in the years after basketball. He was coaching. He held a job at the David Posnack Jewish Day School in Davie, Florida, working with young players, passing on the game that had shaped his whole life. But following the 2013 arrest, the school indicated it would not be renewing his contract. A door that had given him purpose quietly closed. The arrests belong to the record and should not be excused by the hardships surrounding them. The broader context also matters. Anderson was grieving, financially broken, and beginning to discuss experiences he had hidden since childhood. Context can make a life more understandable without erasing responsibility for particular decisions. By this point, Kenny Anderson had become a cautionary tale in the sports pages. But a filmmaker was about to hand him the chance to tell the whole story on his own terms. In 2017, a documentary arrived with a strange and tender title, Mr. Chibbs. It was directed by Jill Campbell, and it did something the box scores and transaction wires never could. It followed Kenny Anderson through his life after basketball, camera rolling, as he confronted the grief, the money troubles, the family strain, and the old wounds he'd finally started naming out loud. This was not a highlight film filled with slow-motion crossovers and triumphant music. It was a portrait of a man trying to understand who he was once the game released him. Anderson had been treated as a finished product while still a child. Mr. Chibbs remained in that uncomfortable space, following a middle-aged man learning how to build a life that basketball had never required him to construct. The film also opened a window onto his complicated world off the court. Kenny was the father of 7 children by 5 different women, a family picture that began back when he was still at Georgia Tech. He'd been married to Tammy Roman, who later became widely known from the reality series Basketball Wives, and together they had 2 daughters, one of them the hip-hop artist Jazz Anderson. Later, he married again, marrying his wife Natasha in 2007. A lot of love, a lot of strain, a lot of people counting on a man who was still working out how to steady himself. What made the documentary land was its refusal to wrap things up neatly. Kenny wasn't presented as fully healed or fully lost. He was presented as human, flawed, grieving, trying. And in telling that truth, he gave a lot of viewers something rare: permission to be honest about their own struggles. But even as he was learning to face himself, his body was about to deliver a warning he never saw coming. Kenny Anderson never fully left the game. He changed his role inside it. He earned a degree in organizational leadership from St. Thomas University in Miami in 2010. In 2018, he became head coach at Fisk University, a historically black institution. After Fisk, he moved into mentoring and player development at Florida Coastal Prep, working on handles, shooting, court vision, and the mental demands carried by players receiving attention at a young age. Then, in February of 2019, came the scare. Near his home in Pembroke Pines, Florida, Anderson suffered a stroke and was hospitalized for several days. For a man who'd already survived so much, the collapse of a fortune, the loss of his mother, the reckoning with childhood pain, it was one more reminder of how fragile all of it really is. And yet, look at what still stands. Back in September of 2008, he'd been inducted into the New York City Basketball Hall of Fame, the ultimate stamp from the town that discovered him. That honor recognized everything the front pages first saw in a 14-year-old, a New York prodigy, a four-time high school legend, a Final Four floor general, the second pick in his draft, an all-star point guard with speed and imagination few ever matched. So what is the real legacy of Kenny Anderson? It is not only the millions that slipped away, or the 9 NBA uniforms he wore, and it is not a tidy redemption story in which honesty repairs every loss. Honesty could not restore the money,